Welcome back, everyone. This is Chapter 54, Part 3, and today we're going to focus on trophic structures. Okay, and remember that your trophic structures, your trophic levels, are really those feeding levels or those feeding relationships between the organisms within your community. All right, so who's the producer, the primary consumer, secondary consumer, so on and so forth. And although they're feeding relationships, what we really focus on is that transfer of energy. Okay, so remember, only 10% of the energy gets transferred from one level to the next. So there's really a lot of energy control going on in terms of the number of organisms we can see in a given level, which is why you don't typically get past a tertiary or quaternary consumer in most communities. There's just simply not enough energy left by the time you get to that fourth level to make a fifth level viable. Okay, and then ultimately that energy then gets retransferred or redistributed back to the inorganics, the abiotic stuff, to keep those primary producers going via our decomposers. So they're not necessarily shown here, but those decomposers are kind of the loop from your top predators here back down to your primary producers. Okay. And food chains are just that one link, and then obviously we know that most community structures are a lot more complex than just seeing one transfer. All right, and that's where your food webs come in to give you a much more clear picture of all of those feeding, energy transferring interactions that go into a community. And so what we really end up seeing when we take a look at these bigger food webs, these bigger pictures, is that a lot of species play more than one role. They're not just a primary consumer. All right, they may be a primary consumer in one aspect of that food web, but maybe a secondary consumer somewhere else or a tertiary consumer somewhere else, so on and so forth. All right, so that makes defining their role in the bigger picture a little bit more complex, but also gives you a much more detailed picture of what's going on within that ecosystem, within that community. So again, remember that there are restrictions on the length of our food chains. And that really comes down to the fact that we only transfer 10% of that energy from one level to the next. Okay, so I've got 100% energy going on, being stored, being created really, at the producer level, but only 10% of that then makes it from that primary consumer, that herbivore, available to the next level above your primary consumer, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's really that limitation on the organic matter and the energy being able to move from one level to the next that keeps it to the number of species, the number of trophic levels we can see. All right, and so that productivity really drives both the number of species we can have as well as the trophic. So if we've got a very high productivity, which is not necessarily typical for most ecosystems, I can have a much larger number of trophic levels and a much larger number of species. Medium, well, that's going to pull those numbers down. Low productivity is going to pull it down even lower. Okay, so keep that in mind. We're going to spend a little bit more time rather than trying to identify who's a primary consumer, who's a tertiary consumer, that kind of thing, on just talking about species that within those food chains have a really large impact despite maybe their numbers or despite what they do within a particular food chain. Okay. And these types of species that have such a large impact are either because they are, in fact, just really high in numbers, what we'll talk about as sort of these dominant species, or the role, the niche that they have within those community dynamics is very pivotal, very unique, very special to keeping everything kind of in line. And that's sort of where we'll talk about the keystone species, We'll also throw in foundational species and some things in that particular category as well. So dominant species are literally dominant in the sense that they are the most abundant in number, have the highest biomass. All right, so just by dry weight, if you will, they have the highest amount of living flesh, living structure. Okay, and simply because of having that large amount of numbers, have a huge control over the occurrence and distribution of their species. Okay, and sort of two hypotheses as to why these dominant species are so successful. One, they're either more capable of outcompeting, all right, so they're better at exploiting or utilizing those limited resources within their environment compared to another species, or they're just better at avoiding their predators. All right, so typically your dominant species are going to be organisms that are lower on your food chain. Okay. Your keystone species tend to be somewhere else in the middle of the food chain. Okay. And in some cases, they may be a top predator, but they're somewhere within, they're not typically at the bottom. Okay. And these guys aren't necessarily large in numbers within the community, but the role that they play is dramatic. All right. So one of the instances is your sea stars in your intertidal zone. All right. And the way that they take over and exert control over invertebrates and algae. All right. When they're there, their control is relatively obvious, particularly when we see them gone. All right. The other option, and this is a pretty famous one, especially out in the northwest, kelp forests, all right, are your sea otters. And what we have discovered, sort of by accident, killing off our top predators, our killer whales here, but as well as killing off these guys by our boating trades and things that are going on out there going through the kelp forests, is that if I don't have these sea otters to eat my sea urchins, all of a sudden those sea urchin populations were able to explode. And those sea urchins really wreaked havoc on the kelp population. All right, so those sea urchins are major herbivores. They'll go through and just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And they were destroying the amount of kelp that was in these kelp forests out off the coasts of things like Washington and Oregon, because we were killing off the sea otter populations by kind of hitting them with the rudders of our boats and doing all of that to them. So not having those sea otters in abundance in the population really had a major impact on everything else in the community structure. Then you've got these foundational species, or what they might also refer to as ecosystem engineers. These guys have a huge influence not on necessarily the trophic levels and the energy transfers within their environment, but more on the physical environment that they create, or in some cases that they destroy. All right, so it's the actual changes that they're making to the environment itself, not what they're doing in terms of a feeding relationship. So beavers are a great example. All right, they build those dams, and for the most part, they're sort of helping to create these little niche ecosystems for other organisms to survive and thrive. Without the beavers, without the dams, those roles that some of those species play isn't really feasible. And so we see sort of a breakdown in the community structure in that sense. Now, not every ecosystem engineer or foundational species is necessarily positive. They can kind of wreak havoc in certain instances, depending on what is necessary within that particular environment. So, from an ecologist standpoint, what we're really looking at are community controls. All right, how do certain organisms play a role within this trophic structure? And how does that then define the interactions of different species within that community? And there's sort of two major models out there. We can talk about kind of a bottom-up model, where there's sort of a unidirectional, one-directional influence from your lower trophic levels to the higher ones. Okay? And this one probably makes the most sense if you tie it back to that 10% energy idea. So the amount of biomass, or the amount of productivity that's going on in your primary producers, your plants, algae, all right, whatever happens to be the bottom of the food chain, the abiotic factors, the absence or abundance, for that matter, of the abiotic nutrients in that ecosystem really drives the amount of plants that can be there, which means the higher the biomass there, the more energy there at the bottom, the more primary producers or primary consumers I can have, the more secondary consumers, so on and so forth. So it really kind of gets tied back to this idea. If I have a very high productivity, I can have a lot of organisms and a lot of trophic levels. But if that productivity at the bottom is low, then my number of trophic levels, number of species is going to be very low. So that's really kind of the essence of this bottom-up model. Okay, so that productivity at the bottom drives everything above it. But we can also flip it on its head and talk about a top-down model, where the control for the abundance of organisms at a lower level is controlled by what's above it. So in this case, we're looking at things like predators controlling the number of herbivores, which then controls the number of primary producers. So if I were to take that top predator out of the environment, well, that's going to allow the individuals below that, their population is going to explode. But what's going to happen? All right, let's just say we've got 3 trophic levels. That top predator is now not eating those herbivores. So those herbivores are able to kind of explode in their population. They're not being controlled. But what then happens in turn is the more herbivores I have, the more eating of the plants and the grasses that's going to happen. And so that then in turn really sort of depletes the plant population. All right, and so there's really that big kind of control going on. The removal of those top predators has huge influences cascading down the food chain as well. And there's a video posted in your notes section for this chapter about the wolves and their major control over their ecosystems. So after this video, take a moment, take a look at that wolf video. It's really kind of a nice example of this top-down model.